Few could have imagined that a neuroscientist who by all expectations should be a strict materialist would one day admit that she is absolutely convinced we can communicate after death. Dr. Tara Swart is not only a neuroscientist, but also a medical doctor and psychiatrist, someone trained to search for rational explanations and to rely on hard evidence. In her professional world, even mentioning signs or contact with the dead is taboo. She had been part of medical teams that, in some cases, involuntarily hospitalized patients and administered medication, including in situations where people reported experiences similar to those she would later face herself. She knew exactly how fragile the line was between science and what many would dismiss as madness. And yet, everything changed after her own devastating loss. Forced into a space where the boundaries of reason could no longer contain her reality, she encountered experiences that defied all the frameworks she had been taught to trust. For a long time, she stayed silent, terrified of being judged by colleagues who might accuse her of abandoning science. But the evidence of her own life and the scientific research she was exploring became impossible to ignore. Finally, she confessed what she had once believed unspeakable. She is 100% certain that communication beyond death is possible. Her statement comes from her training as a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, combined with the deeply personal experiences that reshaped her understanding of consciousness. It is this tension between material science and lived reality that makes her testimony so powerful, and it opens a question that many in her field still consider taboo. In 2021, Tara Swart's life collapsed in a way she had never imagined possible. Her husband Robin died of leukemia, only 2 days before what would have been their 4th wedding anniversary. She describes that moment as being totally lost and broken, unable to see how to go on living in a world that no longer made sense. For someone who had always relied on her mind, her training, and her ability to rationalize, the loss was devastating. She was suddenly standing in the deepest emptiness she had ever known, stripped of all the certainties she once believed in. And then, something unexpected began to happen. Not long after his passing, she started noticing robins around her house. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but she kept seeing robins again and again, especially around her home and garden, in a way she had never noticed before. The connection was impossible to overlook. Her husband's name was Robin, and she began to feel that these birds were a sign of his presence. For a scientist working in a field where such topics were often considered taboo, the experience was deeply unsettling. Yet it was also strangely comforting, as if life itself was giving her a thread to hold on to in the middle of despair. The most shocking moment came one night while she was alone at home. She was in bed when she suddenly felt a powerful blow on her shoulder. When she opened her eyes, she saw a hazy, indistinct outline of a man standing at the foot of her bed. The figure was familiar. It was Robin. And then, just as quickly, it dissolved into the air. Tara later explained that this was not a dream. She was fully awake. She could feel the pain in her shoulder, and the presence was undeniable. For someone who had spent her life diagnosing delusions, it was almost unbearable to consider that she was now experiencing the very thing she had once labeled in patients as a symptom of psychosis. She concluded she could not ignore what had happened. Desperate for answers, she turned to mediums. If anyone could help her understand what was happening, it should have been them. But the sessions left her disappointed. The messages felt vague and unconvincing, and she realized she could not outsource the possibility of communication. If Robin was reaching out, she had to be the one to recognize and respond. The responsibility was hers. Still, as a psychiatrist, she could not silence the professional voice inside her. She asked herself the same questions she would once have asked a patient. Was this grief-induced hallucination? Was it depression pushing her into delusion? Was her brain simply creating patterns to comfort her in the face of loss? She admitted openly that she was frightened by the possibility of being labeled insane. After all, she had spent years on medical teams that hospitalized people who reported similar experiences. But she also noted that she remained functional and self-aware, able to reflect on what was happening to her. The signs were not accompanied by a breakdown of her rational mind. This distinction, though subtle, became a critical point for her. The inner conflict was relentless. On one hand, every part of her scientific training told her that what she was perceiving could not be real. On the other hand, the experiences themselves were so concrete, so visceral, that she could not dismiss them as imagination. The robins were there. The blow on her shoulder was real. Robin had appeared before her eyes. She said she could not simply ignore what had happened, because the experiences felt undeniably real. Slowly she came to accept that her experiences were not merely symptoms of grief, but something larger. That realization pushed her toward a decision. Instead of burying these events in silence, she would examine them the way she examined everything else in life, through science. If communication after death was possible, she wanted to understand how. She began to read, to research, to connect her personal story with the emerging insights of neuroscience. She explored how the brain filters reality, how attention works, and how altered states of consciousness might open doors to perceptions usually closed. It was not a rejection of her scientific identity, but an expansion of it. From the pain of losing Robin, a new path unfolded. What began as unbearable grief transformed into an inquiry that combined both sides of her life: the rigor of neuroscience and the intimacy of personal loss. For the first time, Tara allowed herself to consider that perhaps these two worlds were not opposites at all. Perhaps they were always meant to meet in this very place, where love and science converge on the question of what happens after death. For most of us, the world is explained through 5 senses: sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. But according to Tara Swart, modern neuroscience shows this picture is far too limited. Research now identifies more than 5, often cataloged as a few dozen, distinct sensory modalities. These include balance, proprioception, sensitivity to temperature, and many others. The idea is revolutionary because it reveals that human beings are equipped with far more ways of experiencing reality than we were ever taught in school. Yet most of these channels remain invisible to us in daily life, because the brain acts as a powerful filter. Tara explains that our brains receive enormous amounts of sensory data every second, but only a fraction of this enters our conscious awareness. The structure involved in this filtering is called the reticular activating system, or RAS. It helps determine what gets through and what remains unnoticed. If you buy a new car and suddenly start seeing the same model everywhere, that is not because the cars have magically multiplied overnight, but because your RAS has adjusted and begun to select this information as important. Tara calls this the art of noticing. By deliberately directing attention, people can train themselves to see patterns and signals they would otherwise miss. This is not mystical thinking, but a function of how attention and perception work at the neurological level. Her personal experiences after Robin's death became striking examples of this principle. She recalls that from October 4th, the day she brought Robin home, she began to suffer from aches and pains all over her body that lasted for 6 to 7 weeks. During this period, she received a massage that was so painful, it revealed just how much tension her body was holding. On another occasion, she felt an unusual and persistent coldness in the days before Robin's cremation, when his body was kept in the mortuary. She connected this with the fact that he had always hated the cold. These were not abstract metaphors, but concrete somatic sensations, experiences rooted in her physical system. From her scientific perspective, such events revealed that the body can act as a channel of memory and connection, sometimes expressing what the conscious mind cannot. To make sense of this, she turned to models within neuroscience. One is hyperconnectivity, when different parts of the brain that normally operate separately become more strongly linked. This state can occur under stress, during grief, or in altered states of consciousness, and it often leads to new associations and unusual perceptions. Another model is novelty salience, the brain's mechanism for highlighting things that are new or emotionally significant. This explains why a robin in the garden could suddenly become a powerful sign, while before it might have been ignored. A third model is low-latent inhibition, which means the brain reduces its normal filtering and allows in more sensory data. People with low-latent inhibition often notice details others miss. In some, it leads to creativity and innovation, while in others, it can resemble symptoms of psychosis. Tara emphasizes that this is the fine line she had to walk. As a psychiatrist, she was well aware that many of the things she experienced, thought insertion in bodily sensations, could also be diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia. She even admitted that she was terrified of going insane, but she noticed an important difference. Her functioning remained intact. She could analyze and evaluate her experiences, and she did not lose her grip on external reality. Instead of chaos, she found that her grief had opened a channel of perception, sharpening her senses in ways she could not deny. From this perspective, grief does not equal psychosis, but she suggests that the two can overlap. Not because the bereaved person is mad, but because the brain under extreme stress reduces its usual barriers and lets in signals it normally blocks. Tara suggests that this overlap may explain why the dying and the grieving so often report extraordinary visions, sensations, or encounters. Science shows that our sensory systems are far richer than we believe, and grief may unlock them in unpredictable ways. The challenge is not to dismiss these experiences as delusions, but to investigate them with the same rigor we apply to every other aspect of human perception. For Tara, the conclusion is clear. The brain is not just a closed machine limited to 5 senses, but an open system capable of accessing dozens of different streams of information. By understanding this, we can see how signs, bodily sensations, and moments of unusual clarity fit into a scientific framework. She explained that the more she studied, the more she felt convinced that what had once seemed impossible, communication beyond death, was consistent with the very principles of neuroscience she had spent her life studying. Grief had shattered her world, but it also opened the door to a wider view of what consciousness might be. When Tara Swart began exploring the possibility of consciousness beyond the brain, she turned to the evidence collected by doctors who had studied people on the threshold between life and death. These were not stories from mystics or poets, but clinical accounts described by physicians who themselves had undergone near-death experiences or had documented them in their patients. The consistency of these reports and the fact that they came from highly trained medical professionals gave them a credibility that could not be dismissed as fantasy. One of the cases Tara highlights is that of Dr. Mary Neal, an orthopedic spine surgeon who nearly drowned in a kayaking accident. She was trapped underwater for a prolonged time before being resuscitated. Yet she later described a vivid and peaceful experience of leaving her body, moving toward a place of radiant light, and feeling surrounded by love. For her, this was not a dream, but an encounter that changed her life and convinced her of the reality of an afterlife. As a scientist herself, Tara found it striking that a surgeon who had no incentive to fabricate such a story would openly risk her reputation to share it. Another example comes from Dr. Eben Alexander, a Harvard-trained neurosurgeon who contracted a severe bacterial meningitis that left him in a coma for a week. Doctors believed his condition was so severe that survival was highly unlikely. Yet when he recovered, he reported an extraordinary journey into what he described as a heavenly realm, complete with encounters that gave him an overwhelming sense of meaning and connection. Before the coma, Alexander had been skeptical, even dismissive, of spiritual claims. Afterward, he became convinced that consciousness is not produced by the brain alone. For Tara, this shift was powerful evidence of how experiences at the edge of death can radically transform even the most materialist of scientists. She also refers to cases documented by Dr. Bruce Grayson, one of the world's leading researchers on near-death experiences. Grayson tells of a hospital patient who, during his own near-death episode, claimed to have seen a nurse who had recently died. According to his account, this nurse gave him a message to pass on to her parents, something he could not possibly have known on his own. Such examples have been interpreted by some researchers as suggesting access to information beyond ordinary sensory channels. Tara does not present these as final proof, but she argues that they pose serious questions that material neuroscience cannot yet answer. Closely related to these accounts is the phenomenon of terminal lucidity. This occurs when patients who may have been unresponsive for weeks or even months suddenly regain clear awareness just hours before death. Family members report that loved ones with advanced dementia or brain injury can suddenly recognize them, speak coherently, and even offer words of farewell. For Tara, this is one of the most difficult puzzles in neuroscience. How can a severely damaged brain produce a moment of perfect clarity just before shutting down forever? In purely material terms, it is difficult to explain. The possibility raised by such phenomena is that consciousness may not be entirely generated by the brain. Instead, the brain could act more like a receiver or filter, limiting awareness during life, but allowing it to expand in extraordinary circumstances, such as at the moment of death. If this is the case, then experiences like NDEs and terminal lucidity are not malfunctions, but glimpses of a broader reality. Tara is careful in her language. She does not claim to have solved the mystery, but she insists that the evidence cannot be ignored. These accounts suggest that consciousness may not be entirely dependent on the physical body. In exploring these ideas, Tara refers to Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious and the universal experiences of birth, life, and death. She sees these archetypal patterns as resonating with her own understanding that the mind cannot be reduced to individual neurons firing in isolation. She notes Jung's account alongside modern cases, seeing both as pointing toward dimensions of consciousness that extend beyond ordinary waking awareness. The deeper meaning for Tara is that dying may open a doorway to realities normally hidden from us. In the altered state that comes with leaving the body, or in the final surge of clarity before death, people gain access to perceptions and knowledge that the ordinary brain would not normally allow. From the standpoint of conventional neuroscience, this remains an enigma. But from her combined perspective as a scientist and as someone who has lived through devastating loss, Tara sees it as an essential clue. Rather than treating these events as anomalies to be dismissed, she argues they should be recognized as signals pointing toward a larger truth about consciousness. Tara Swart emphasizes that communication with those who have passed is not about waiting passively for something supernatural to happen. It is about learning how to notice, how to pay attention in ways that most people never practice. The brain, through the reticular activating system, filters out the majority of sensory input. By consciously opening ourselves to patterns and coincidences, we can start to perceive what she calls signs. This is not about magic, but about training attention. Like exercising a muscle, the more one practices, the stronger the ability becomes. Nature, she says, is one of the most powerful settings for this practice. When you are outside, watching birds, clouds, or even the movement of trees, you are more likely to see patterns that connect with your inner world. For her personally, robins became the first and most persistent sign of Robin's presence. But she explains that anyone can discover their own language of signs by allowing themselves to be still and observant in nature. Creativity is another pathway. Music, painting, dance, or storytelling all shift the brain into a state where patterns are more easily noticed. In these moments, the conscious mind relaxes, and the subconscious can bring forward associations that would otherwise stay hidden. Tara describes creativity as a kind of bridge, making it easier for the mind to register signals that would normally be filtered out. Community is equally important. She notes that for a long time she kept her experiences secret because of the stigma attached to them. Yet sharing in a safe environment where others will not dismiss or pathologize your stories can be healing and validating. Being part of a community that accepts the possibility of signs makes it easier to notice and trust them. Her own life offers striking examples of how this can work. At one point, she asked Robin to send her a sign that could not be mistaken. Soon after, she was traveling and kept encountering the word Phoenix. It appeared in the name of the city she flew to, Phoenix, Arizona, and then again at a restaurant called Phoenix Garden. For her, repeatedly seeing this word became a clear signal of Robin's presence. On another occasion, she recalls finding an elastic band on the floor near the hospital where Robin had been treated. It had formed the shape of an infinity sign. For Tara, who had been asking for reassurance, this simple object became a message of eternal connection. Skeptics might dismiss these moments as confirmation bias, the human tendency to see meaning where none exists. Tara acknowledges this. As a scientist, She knows the brain is wired to detect patterns and that coincidences happen. But her conclusion is pragmatic. Even if these signs are created by the brain, they provide comfort, strength, and healing. And if they are more than that, then they represent a genuine form of communication. Either way, the practice of noticing is beneficial. To her, the key is to use this mechanism to our advantage rather than argue endlessly about its origin. She often compares this process to going to the gym. At first, the signs might seem faint or rare, but the more you pay attention, the stronger the perceptual muscle becomes. Over time, the brain adjusts, the RAS becomes more finely tuned, and signs appear more clearly and more often. It is not about forcing anything, but about creating the right conditions for perception. This connects directly to somatic practices, methods that work with the body as much as the mind. Tara highlights dance, yoga, and massage as ways of releasing stored emotions and opening channels of awareness. Grief and trauma are not only mental, they are carried in the body's tissues. Releasing this through movement and touch can create space for new perceptions to emerge. She points to what she describes as a serotonin hypothesis, suggesting that trauma may be stored in the body because of changes in capillary tone and blood flow to the skin, fascia, and muscles, and that practices like massage or movement can help release this. For her, this provides a biological foundation for the idea that working with the body enhances openness to signs. She also explores the gut-brain axis, the two-way communication system between the digestive system and the brain. A healthy microbiome does not only affect physical health, it also shapes intuition and decision-making. Tara suggests that improving gut health can sharpen the ability to sense and trust subtle signals. What people often call gut instinct may in fact be a neurological reality, one that supports clearer intuition. In the end, Tara frames the whole practice as a form of training. By engaging with nature, creativity, community, and the body, people can develop the skill of noticing. It is not about abandoning science, but about applying it to the deepest human questions. Through her own journey, she has seen how perception can shift when the filters of the brain are opened, and how signs can provide comfort, guidance, and even a sense of continuing relationship with those who have died. For her, this is evidence that communication after death is possible. In her search for practices that mirror the states people experience near death, Tara Swart describes the ancient Tibetan tradition of dark retreats. These involve spending extended periods, from 7 to 49 days, in complete darkness. Without external light, many practitioners report that spontaneous imagery and visions arise. People report seeing bright lights, animals, mythical beings, and sometimes entire landscapes. For Tara, this is significant because it reproduces many of the elements described in near-death experiences. The result is often a dramatic shift in perspective. Fear of death diminishes, while feelings of compassion, joy, and acceptance of life increase. What is remarkable is that such profound changes arise not through dying, but through an intentional practice that alters consciousness in a controlled way. She also mentions other altered states that can shift perception. Breathwork, the use of psychedelics, immersion in art, and time in nature can all bring the brain into conditions where it relaxes its usual filters. In these moments, people often feel connected to something larger than themselves, sensing meaning, unity, or guidance. Tara acknowledges these states are neurochemically mediated and hallucination-like, but she sees them as a meaningful glimpse into what's possible, an opening to experiences usually blocked by the brain's normal filters. Her conclusion from all of this is striking. As a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, she suggests that consciousness may not be entirely explained by neural activity alone. Practices like dark retreats and other altered states show that the brain is more like a gateway than a generator, a filter rather than a container. Through her own personal journey, she has become convinced that communication after death is possible, and she states openly that she is 100% certain of this. For Tara, this realization has reshaped her mission. Having once felt broken by the loss of her husband, she now dedicates herself to helping others navigate grief and to teaching them how to notice signs of ongoing connection. Her own path shows how science and lived experience can come together, offering both explanation and comfort. In breaking her silence, she insists that the question of life after death can no longer remain a taboo subject. It belongs not only to spirituality, but also to science, to be studied and understood as part of the human condition. Have you ever received signs from loved ones who have passed away that simply can't be explained as coincidence? Do you believe in life after death? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. By doing so, you'll be supporting my channel, which truly needs your help. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.